I want to take some of the, can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to take some of the history of the Roman Empire and try to move it into the modern world for a moment. Does civic virtue presuppose good or better economic times? And I'll give you an example of that. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about healthcare reform in the modern world today. And there's a segment of the American public that feels that that's not my problem, it's someone else's problem. There was a piece on a business series the other night that talked about people walking away from homes that are in foreclosure. And of course, the other flip side of that is what an individual does ultimately has a cost to society, as we saw throughout the Roman Empire. And you saw this decline of the Roman Empire, that this loss of civic virtue as the Roman economy began to go to deteriorate. So my question is, how do you achieve that balance between civic virtue, the fundamental Republican idea, and natural rights? Because if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, that balance really began more to tip towards natural rights, and that many historians, some historians would argue that that was the beginning of the downfall of the Roman Empire.
I would argue that civic virtue doesn't presuppose a good economy. I would argue that civic virtue presupposes a bad economy. Certainly in the United States, when we see the outpourings of neighbor-on-neighbor help, it's after disasters. If we look at Hurricane Katrina, if we look at the flooding of the Red River, it's when these natural disasters happen is when we see civic virtue truly come out in America. And if we look to Rome, I would argue the same. That the civic virtue, the height of the Roman Republic is when they're a small little city-state on the Italian peninsula struggling to get by against bigger and better neighbors. It's only after they conquer Carthage and Corinth in the same year and they gorge themselves on the wealth of the Mediterranean do citizens really begin to deteriorate in their virtue and in their corruption because they no longer need the state. They have their own personal wealth.
As to your central question of how do we balance this notion of civic virtue and natural rights theory, I think that's a constant experiment that's been played out in the entire history of the government. The founders didn't really view themselves as a part of any one camp. They thought this notion of natural rights could be compatible with civic virtue. If you look at Scottish Enlightenment, Hume, for example, thought that individuals had an internal moral compass, and so government didn't need to necessarily worry about the virtue aspect. So long as it protected rights, individuals would go ahead and promote the virtue that they inherently had. Other theorists like Ferguson would argue civic virtue in the end can't ever completely be instilled. He argued that maybe if you set up a national military that you could promote this virtue, but even he in the end argued in the end natural rights will win out. I personally
Go ahead.
think that natural rights is the ultimate thing that the government should have to individually protect, and that civic virtue has really come down to more, like my colleague stated earlier, small homogeneous decisions that maybe a family could instill.
James, anything to add? We'd like to move on to another question.
The only thing that I would say is I would agree with my first colleague that times of economic downfall.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Steve, very quickly wanted to go back to the very beginning of your discussion. King James I argued that only a king, not a republic, a king responsible to God, could guarantee the liberty of all of the king's subjects. Are you sure that they dismissed all other forms of government out of hand?
No, and I think we argued in our opening speech that Madison did incorporate some monarchical principles into the presidency. He wanted to certainly an efficient enforcer of these laws that Congress passed. And so he gave the president the ability to enforce these laws much like a king, but unlike a king, checked it with the rest of the organs of state.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Even though it's the last day, we are compelled to provide feedback. Let's start.
Well, thank you, Susan. Very strong presentation. You really know the materials. What I really like about your presentation is that you really understand the history of the period. I really tried to challenge this whole notion of Madison's model of government as a system of large-scale conflict resolution, and I was trying to punch holes in that. And I thought, I believe that there's, you really attacked this issue of the difference between the balance between civic virtue and natural rights really very well. I spent a few years living in Rome, and I watched that. I used to walk by the Colosseum, and you could see sort of the decline of the Roman Empire. And I always thought it was maybe more a matter of natural rights had kind of overtaking. But when you throw in the economy and the wars, and so I have to say you really have a good grasp of the material, and it's truly an honor to be with groups like yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was indeed an honor to be here with you. I I wish we'd had more time to talk about the idea of virtue, because I keep wanting to go back to the Italian concept of virtù, which meant something very different. And I'm not really sure what the founders were meaning virtue in our modern sense, or virtù in the Renaissance sense, because they were there in the middle of it, and that would create a very different understanding of civic virtue.
I thought you did a terrific job. You obviously have grasped the history very well. I would urge you to go back and revisit the Constitutional Convention. Madison's plan that he proposed and defended looked almost nothing like what the convention wound up adopting. He didn't have a plan for the executive. He came unprepared to deal with the executive. His was a theory of representation. The notion that there are monarchical elements built into a system based on popular sovereignty scares me. I would urge you to at least rethink it, and maybe it's a matter of defining terms, but monarchy derives its authority from some source other than the people, and it's very clear in our founding documents that republicanism is derived either directly or indirectly from the people. So organizing the structure, I think the founders would argue, did not undermine the notion of popular sovereignty. Now, maybe they were wrong, and as I say, it may all just be a definitional matter, but that's the only place where I would really urge you to think a little more. And his notion that federalism was a good thing. Take a look sometime at Madison's diary after he lost on the Connecticut Compromise. Disaster. Federalist 39, written in the form of a dialogue. Madison's having to defend something he thought was awful. We have turned it into a great virtue, whether in the Italian or modern sense, but Madison sure didn't. So those are the only places that I would urge you to continue to think and struggle with this material. What an extraordinary way for us to get to start our day with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.